A Passion for Mushrooms by Chrononautical. Chapter 30. Poisoned by Mushrooms.
Oh dear!
Looking from the broken dish on the floor beside him to his fellow master in the culinary guild, Bilbo realized what he had been tasting in the canapes.
We call them black bowlers because they look so much like trilbies, but yes, Darrow, I agree, they are quite poisonous. Oh, do not let anyone else eat them. How could they have got mixed in with my trilbies? I pick all my mushrooms by hand. I would have noticed ages ago if any bowlers grew in my little mine.
Treachery!
Thorin bellowed, moving his sword away from Darrow's throat, but not sheathing it. Bilbo suspected that the sword would not rest until it found a throat to cut, but he could not worry about that now. He had his own troubles. The king under the mountain looked forceful, mighty, and, to one who knew him well, completely terrified.
Oin! Oin! Come at once! Lord Baggins has been poisoned!
Doran, son of Thorin, yelled. His face was nearly as red as his beard. The dwarf was clearly furious about the attack, which was rather flattering. After all of their many arguments, it was somewhat encouraging to know that Doran still saw the hobbit as one of his people. Apparently Bilbo was someone to be defended from the outsiders the dwarf hated so much.
I saw the man who gave him the plate. He wore the livery of Bad's house.
Then Bilbo could not focus on the shouting, for Orin was at his side, pushed there by the roiling of the gathered crowd. Instantly the aged healer was on the floor, inspecting both the hobbit and the remains of the destroyed canapes.
"There is nothing that can be done."
Darrow's voice was soft and broken amidst the great uproar of confusion that threatened to turn the party into a riot.
"Even a sliver on the tongue is deadly."
It's fine,
Bilbo said, levering himself to his feet.
I'll be fine.
His stomach lurched, proving what a lie that was.
The mushrooms are poisonous to hobbits.
His stomach cramped again.
At least no mushrooms are deadly. I should have died 100 times over as a falling if there was a mushroom to be found on the forest floor that could kill a hobbit. Only, I beg you will excuse me.
You're not going anywhere.
Thorin growled.
Oin!
"She's right, lad," Oin said unhappily. "There is no antidote for such a poison, and I certainly didn't bring such a potion to a party. Perhaps syrup of ipyak. Bard might have some on hand. If the hobbit vomits quickly, there may yet be a chance."
I am not going to vomit,
Bilbo said very quickly.
I assure you I will be quite well, only you must excuse me.
You have to do something.
Thorin demanded of Oin, completely ignoring Bilbo even as he held tight to his arm and kept the hobbit from leaving.
Thorin!
Dwalin put a heavy hand on the king's shoulder.
The hobbit knows what is needed, and he says he will not die. You must let him go.
Thorin's face twisted in rage.
The hobbit knows what he must now do.
Dwalin insisted, stressing the word hobbit strangely to Bilbo's ear.
I will guard him and carry him, if I must.
That was even more unusual, for Bilbo would not need to be carried, though he did need to get away from the crowd as quickly as possible. Perhaps dwarven speed would not go amiss. Thorin blinked and released Bilbo at once.
Take care of him,
he ordered. Dwalin nodded once, but Bilbo didn't stick around to see what else happened. The members of the company had cleared a path for him, and he was able to dash from the room as quick as a rabbit fleeing a fox. There was a small privy just down the corridor, and Bilbo managed to make it by the skin of his nose, slamming the door shut behind him. Then it came. Never in his life had he quaked so. The cramping in his stomach felt like a warg at its jaws around his midsection, squeezing. The bile burned his throat like molten gold, spewing up to choke him in the process. He could not breathe through the heaving. It filled his nose as well as his mouth. Adding insult to injury, he could taste the dreaded canapes a second time around. The flavor was not improved by stomach acid. Over and over his throat seized and his stomach cramped until there was nothing left, and still his body worked as though trying to turn him inside out to ensure that every scrap of mushroom could be scraped from the pocket of his stomach. After an eternity of this, he stopped seizing long enough to breathe, resting his face on the cool stone of the privy floor. Really, he was lucky to be a Dale, for many homes in Hobbiton did not have toilets kept as clean as Bard's was. Some places in the Shire did not even have proper plumbing or running water. If Bilbo had not been able to flush away the smell of his vomit, he was quite sure matters would be much worse. However, in the Shire, no one would have deliberately poisoned him, not even his cousin Lobelia. Black bowlers were dangerous, and he'd been obfuscating the truth a little to say that no hobbit ever died from eating one. The very young or the very old could potentially die from the awful dehydrating vomiting that always accompanied such a poisoning. As it was, simply emptying his stomach into a clean toilet was the best possible scenario for such a situation. And then it came again. He had not taken a drink or even swallowed the air that cooled his desolate throat. There was nothing to regurgitate, and yet his body insisted. His stomach heaved, but suddenly that was not the worst of it. At once Bilbo rushed to lower his breeches and take a seat upon the privy. Though he still vomited, there was nothing coming out of his mouth, and so he coughed into the air as his intestines spilled their watery contents into the basin beneath him. That burned as well, in a most unpleasant place. Eventually, he was able to rise shakily and pull the chain, washing away the smell once more with a rush of water. Unfortunately, soon after that, he was seated again, expelling. It seemed that his body would force the poisons from his every orifice by any means necessary. Probably this was a better fate than the instant death that would have awaited a dwarf or man who ate the same mushrooms. Not to be left out, even Bilbo's eyes began to weep. Whether this was from the poisoning, the pain, or simple shame, the hobbit did not know. He choked, he shat, and he cried miserably, stuck in a privy while Thorin was out there likely facing down a poisoner who wanted to assassinate him. Bilbo would not let him face such an enemy alone. Rising, he tugged up his breeches and went over to the sink to carefully rinse his mouth. He spat 3 times for good luck, but apparently that wasn't good enough. The moment water touched his tongue, he was back to the toilet, expelling again. It was almost tiresome, really, except for the excruciating pain of the process. Obstinately, Bilbo fixed his clothing and washed his face a second time. Rinsing his mouth, he spat 3 times for good luck. Nothing happened. Taking a few deep breaths to steady himself, the hobbit took a little more water and gargled it to soothe his burned throat. Once again, he got away with it. The looking-glass showed a creature much the worse for wear, with dark circles around his eyes and sallow skin. He looked unhappily like a younger version of Gollum for a moment. Fortunately, he had been quick enough not to get anything on his mithril coat, and so he need not go naked as that creature did. Daringly, Bilbo took a small sip of water just to settle his churning stomach. That dropped the fat into the fire, all right. Yet again, Bilbo found himself hunched over the toilet, coughing, spluttering, and seizing. It had been foolish to push. Once again, he had to sit on the toilet, cramping, though all that was left in his intestines seemed to be bile and acid. Clearly, his body wanted to expel all of that as well. There was no choice in the matter, and Bilbo was in too much pain to fight. Then he saw his crown of flowers upon the floor. The jade oak leaves glittered in the flickering lamplight. It must have fallen off during one of the racking fits which shook his whole body. The crown was not damaged. In fact, Bilbo rather suspected the thing could be dropped from the top of the lonely mountain without suffering a scratch, for mithril was a sturdy metal and Thorin a master of his craft. Yet it was lying there on the privy floor as though Bilbo had tossed it aside. He'd only been able to wear it for less than 24 hours. If a time ever came when he'd been wearing it every day for 2 years, still he would not want to drop it casually on the floor of a privy, no matter how clean. It was the gift of Thorin's love, worth more than all the flowers and jewels in the world combined. Bilbo stood. He cleaned himself up. Rinsing his mouth, he gargled, spat, and took a drink of water. He stayed down. Picking his crown up, he polished it carefully with a handkerchief. Though he took great care with all of the flowers, he paid special attention to the little forget-me-nots. Each one received a gentle stroke as the hobbit inspected his prized possession carefully. All of them were well, and he was right that there had been no damage in the fall. Never again would he be so careless. And yet he had not been careless, he had been poisoned. There could be no doubt that the plate had been handed to him specifically. Perhaps the poisoner had intended for Bilbo to share with Thorin, as they often did, or perhaps not. That much was unknown. However, there could be no doubt that the hobbit would eat the canapes once he had them in hand. Moreover, someone must have planned in advance, indeed, to find the poisonous mushroom that could be mistaken so readily for the black trilbies, which Bilbo was well known to favor. Such actions could only be very deliberate indeed. But why would a man of Dale want to kill a mushroom farmer, and why so publicly? It was certainly possible that Bilbo had offended someone on one of his many visits to the little city. It was equally possible that the attack had nothing to do with his relationship to Thorin, but that did not seem likely. After all, a fellow was forced to consider that such a poisoning could have more than a single motivation. Killing Bilbo was one thing. For a man in the livery of Bard's house to kill Bilbo was quite another. Beyond that, to poison Bilbo on Durin's Day, on the 1-year celebration of their entry into the mountain and the defeat of Smaug, could only be an insult to Thorin's authority. Such a prominent death would quite derail the festivities. All of the planned festivities. Bilbo placed the crown upon his head and fixed his curls around it. There was no chance of making himself look well, but after some little effort he appeared marginally presentable. Straightening his spine, he opened the privy door and went to find his enemy.